And hello and welcome now also on the official recording. Today, a little bit theoretical lecture, but I hope it has some real-life implications on your life so that you can draw some parallels from the theoretical parts to real-life situations. And we're also going to do a little bit of a weird, let's call it socioeconomic or sociology part in here that may answers the question, or that essentially goes in the direction of the question of whether all of this AI stuff and high-end automation that at least some of you are studying as part of Digitech is really going to ensure that we're all finally going to work less and not 60 or 80 hours a week just to make a living, or whether this might actually not be the case, and if we have been in this situation before, that people promised us and predicted us that if all that stuff just, or all this technology stuff just moves fast enough, then at some point we will not have to work or barely have to work and still have a life full of consumables and all our desires met and so on and so on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's first do the quick reminder and the boring news update stuff. Please do the course evaluation. Let us know what you think about this course. What is good? What is bad? Please let us know if there is something good about this course so that we do not change it next time. Please also let us know what could be done better about this course so that we do not repeat the mistake again next time. It is highly experimental what we're doing here. I know this is not the usual lecture way. And also trying to accommodate online and offline audience is sometimes a little bit quirky, but we're trying our best, so let us know what we can do better. I think you have another 1 or 2 weeks to do the evaluation, but please don't procrastinate it. Good, that leads us to the first part of this lecture, because it's gonna be 2 to 2.5 parts. Quick recap on what we did in one of the last lectures, or like some of the last lectures when we talked about the circular economy. So we discussed that the linear economy is not really the way to go to the future, because taking resources, make something out of this, and then later throwing it away doesn't really work in a system with finite resources. So potential solution to that was this idea of a circular economy. I'm trying to circulate any type of resource that I have for as long as possible, trying to keep it at the highest, highest purity level, highest quality level for as long as possible, and in a best case scenario, not having any waste or any loss of resources by keeping everything in cycles all the time. We talked about the ETCE strategies like reuse, repair, repurpose, manufacture, and at some point also recover or recycle. We talked about the era of de-alloy, and so on and so on. So there were like some pointers towards solution in there. We talked also about the performance economy as a special flavor of the circular economy, where I'm not buying products anymore to then subsequently fulfill some of the needs that I have. We had this example of these drilling machines. Usually people own drilling machines not because they love and like drilling machines. Usually they own them because they have the need of holes in a wall or in a sheet of wood, or like in a plank of wood, and they need to drill holes into that. Practically, most of them are not interested in owning the drilling machine. They're interested in buying results or having the result of a drilled hole. So instead of selling the drilling machine to do holes, we're selling the results. That was pretty much the main idea of the performance economy. We also discussed in one of the MOOC videos that even though the circular economy has some interesting points and is definitely better than a linear economy, that it still inherits various downsides of the economic system that are inherently baked into the linear as well as the circular economy, that both systems still very much emphasize that you should consume as much as possible. Like none of them tells you to just consume less. They are still trying to sell you as much shit as possible at the cost of the environment. And there is not really they essentially trying to decouple economic growth and the consumption of natural resources. But since most processes are not really perfect in terms of material loss, resource loss, energy loss, and so on, it works to a certain extent, but it doesn't really hold true in reality that you can say, okay, we can grow indefinitely while still using the same amount of resources. So there's always like some kind of a loss function. We also talked about this circular society idea where they went beyond these economic discussion points that are predominantly discussed in these circular and linear economy scenarios, but it never really addressed like these questions why we even need a never-ending economic growth. Like it's baked into capitalism, it's baked into most of economic systems that you need some kind of economic growth, but that's definitely something for Roland Menges to talk about, or some basics of economy, like how does money come into place, where does money come from, and how does the foundation of an economy work. But given the systems that we have right now, it's somehow necessary to have this never-ending growth, but it doesn't really explain why we need it in the first place, except for like we need to do it so that capitalism works, but why do we need capitalism to work, and so on and so on. That's not really addressed. And it also doesn't really justify why it's good to consume as many goods and services as possible in a most shortest time span that you can have. Like essentially that's what most of our economic systems is or are about. Consume as much as you can before you die. Then you have lived a good and fulfilling life. Why your life was fulfilling, why when you did that, it's still up for debate. Good. Today we're going to look at some alternative approaches, even though not in too much detail. It's more about like giving pointers in some directions. One direction there is the concept of sufficiency, that you're saying, okay, I need X and then I'm good, and everything on top doesn't really give me much more. It also goes a little bit in the direction of like challenging this entrepreneurial mindset and the shareholder concept, but we'll get into that a little bit later, and some of those parts have already been touched in the circular society section. Good. So we're gonna introduce 3 terms now that together then explain this eco-sufficiency thought. We're first gonna start with eco-efficiency, which is for a lot of students from technical university often the most intuitive one, because if you're an engineer, if you're a computer scientist, if you're a chemist, or whatever, there's very often the quest or the task to optimize something for efficiency, even of course in economies as well. But there are universities that might have less engineering focus who do not deal with efficiency maximization all the time. So the idea of eco-efficiency is to minimize the material input required to achieve a certain economic result. For example, improve the ratio between the use of a resource and the production of goods. So let's say back in the days, it took me 5 pieces of wood to build a box. Now I figured out a magic way to just do it with 4 pieces of woods, or I could use smaller pieces of woods, or they don't have to be that thick, something along those lines. Different example that might be more in our modern time. A car that consumes 3 liters per 100 kilometer is 2 times more ecologically efficient, so we're talking about eco-efficiency here, than a car that consumes 6 liters. So I managed to optimize and make it more efficient how much dead dinosaurs I need to put in the engine or into the gas tank to move 100 kilometer for that car. So that's a pretty simple and quite intuitive example. Eco-consistency is probably not as intuitive to most people. As someone just raising hands, I'm not asking a question, just any ideas? Like, do you have a feeling for consistency, for eco-consistency? Not many hands up here. At least one person should have a feeling what it is. Ecological consistency is based on the damage intensity and the environmental impact of the resources used. Instead of reducing their quantity, their nature or the product design should be optimized so that no emissions or waste are produced, regardless of the level of consumption. It's something that, for example, happens in the circular economy. What's a good example there? A battery electric vehicle that runs on green energy instead of dead dinosaurs. You still have like this lingering questions of where does this green energy come from? If I'm just using dead dinosaurs to run a diesel generator, then charge the battery electric vehicle, then I haven't really won much. I probably even lost something on the way, but if I'm charging the battery electric vehicle with, for example, solar or wind, there's at least, like I'm going in the right direction. So I'm trying to replace one means of operating something or doing something by a less environmentally or ecologically damaging process. So instead of dead dinosaurs, I'm trying to use green energy as a simple example. Let's put two parts here together before we move on to sufficiency. So we're now trying to put efficiency and consistency together. So first, we minimize the fuel energy consumption of a car. So we had this 6 liter and 3 liter example, but I can of course also apply that to battery electric vehicle. So mine, for example, uses roughly 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. If we can find a way to dial that down to 15, then we have essentially put both of them together. So I substituted first my dead dinosaur car with a battery electric vehicle one, and then also trying to optimize then later so that I can move further with the same amount of energy, or with less energy actually. Which then leads us to the more interesting part, the eco-sufficiency aspect. Seeking enough when more is possible is both intuitive and rational, personally, organizational, and ecologically. And under global ecological constraints, it's ethical. It's something that a guy called Thomas Princeton said about sufficiency. So very flowery words, but essentially the point is, if you have enough, why do you want more? Why do you need more? And is it even ethical to want more and then even take more if you already have fulfilled most of your needs? The IPCC defined it slightly different. Sufficiency, or more specifically eco-sufficiency, is a set of policy measures and daily practices that avoid the demand of energy, materials, land, water, and other natural resources while providing well-being for all within the planetary boundaries. Especially the last part should ring some silent bells in the distance, because it's going a little bit in the direction of the definition of sustainability that we used before. Trying to cover your own needs without compromising the needs of other future generations. And in one sentence or less, summary for sufficiency is pretty much like all you need is less. And there's actually also a nice book about that. If you have trouble falling asleep, can highly recommend it. But the main point for eco-sufficiency is, of course, a little bit like, I'm trying to tell it in a joking manner here, but it is obviously a little bit more serious here. Let's make an example for eco-sufficiency that potentially also being applicable for your future personal life. So you have a 100 square meter apartment where you can live with your family or alone. Heat demand is 130 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, so 130 times 120. You can make it more energy efficient by, for example, increasing the insulation. Then you would need less kilowatt hours to heat the apartment at the same, or to the same temperature over the year, because you're losing less heat to the outside. So you can insulate it better. You can also try to go for a more efficient heating system that requires less energy to heat the apartment. Switching between different heating systems like wood, oil, gas, electricity in terms of heat pumps, and so on, like different equations and different calculations there. So that would be the energy efficiency part. Consistency, minimize the ecological damage by choosing the most sustainable way of heating or the most sustainable way of insulation. There are some more ecological ways of insulating your home than putting plastic-based systems or essentially dead dinosaur-based systems around your house. But of course, the prime example here would be to choose a heating system that is the least damaging to the environment. Not just in terms of what happens if I burn it, but also what do I need to do to extract it. Cutting down a tree here is bad for everything that lives on that tree, including the tree. But if I have to drill various deep holes in a protected marine system and get some oil out of there, then transport it here, first by ship and then by car or truck or whatever, different calculations in terms of what's less or more ecologically damaging. But what's the most eco-sufficiency solution? Just live in a smaller apartment. Do you need 120 square meters? Like personally, we're living at the moment in 75 square meters with 2 people and 2 dogs. And we're barely using our living room. I could probably work with less, so 50 square meters probably being fine. And well, by the way, we're also moving, so that's not going to be a problem for any time, like a long-term problem. But essentially, this point, like you having a supply of, let's say, an apartment, and you're taking it, like you're making different considerations, like is the location right, is the price right, is it a little bit bigger than I actually needed? Yeah, okay, but this is just the supply side. But if you're ever in the situation where you actually have a choice, you could, for example, then consider, do I really need such big an apartment? Do I just getting this apartment because I might need that space in the future? Or when you're in this very luxurious position that at some point you might be rich enough to actually buy and plan your own house, that you're building it from scratch. Most houses are built way bigger than they're actually needed. And then you get 2 children, at some point they move out, and then you're in a very similar situation as, for example, my parents or most parents. Then you have a huge house for yourself that you're living in with 2 people. I mean, my grandmother has a 90 square meter apartment. She doesn't need that, but she also doesn't want to move out because it's too much of a hassle. My parents have an even bigger house, and there are just 2 people there who work most of the time. They don't need such a big thing, but it's convenient to have it, and it would be such a hassle to move out or to do something different. So eco-sufficiency is essentially about honestly questioning whether what you have is sufficient, and do you really need more, or are you already having more than you actually need, and then figuring out ways to minimize the footprint that you have on the environment on our planet by potentially downsizing. Is it fine if I go on vacation in the Harz region, or do I really need to go on a world cruise ship tour? Sure, both of them are vacation options, but which one would be more self-sufficient? So this is essentially this idea that I briefly wanted to touch upon with eco-efficiency, making existing processes or things more efficient, eco-consistency, trying to make those less environmentally damaging, and then eco-sufficiency, essentially questioning, do I already have enough? What would be enough for me, which is of course like an extremely personal question, and then putting that into perspective to what you need, have, and want. There are obviously also some challenges and problems attached here. Efficiency and consistency allow you to either continue living a nice life using less resources, if you're just trying to make it more efficient, or live even more comfortably using the same amount of resources. And that is unfortunately the tendency that we have as humans most of the time. That instead of saying, okay, then we need less, so let's say your car now consumes less dead dinosaurs. That would be great. Now that it's cheaper, there's an incentive to just drive your car around more often, which then annihilates the eco-efficiency boost that you just achieved by making the car more efficient. So making something more efficient often has a tendency to then cause increased consumption of this thing that we just made more efficient, and then you're back to square one. So there is this promise to maintain your individual freedom of making your own choices and doing whatever you like by fixing ecological challenges and downsides using technological or political actions. So if we just have this technology, you all can still go on vacation and on a world tour cruise ship thingy. If we just do X, Y, that, you do not have to recycle. If we do just X, Y, that, or if AI finally comes there, if Gen AI makes it, it will solve all our problems, including climate change and world peace. We just have to push a little bit further. Like there is for various technologies the same storybook that they are trying to sell and overemphasize in terms of making you very happy to follow that stream, and then also, of course, taking some of your bad conscience away in exchange for supporting a certain technology. Battery electric vehicle has probably been one of these like very recent examples here before the big AI boom. If we all just drive battery electric vehicle, and I'm saying this as a person who drives a battery electric vehicle, if we all just do this, then we do not have to worry about the environment anymore because everything will be fine. But the battery electric vehicle is not going to save the planet, it's going to save the automotive industry, but definitely not the planet, because it still requires a shitload of resources. It still causes a shitload of environmental damage. It's not something that we get for free without any downsides or any disadvantages. Sure, on paper and also in reality, it is more sustainable, given a certain amount of kilometers driven, to drive a battery electric vehicle than a combustion engine car. But it does not mean that by driving a kilometer in a battery electric vehicle, I'm doing something good to the environment. I'm still damaging it, just less than in a combustion engine car. Different perspective or a different aspect to this is also the question of consumption. Like usually you consume things because you either need them, like water and food, otherwise you might drop dead, or because they increase your well-being, they make you happy. Usually you do not consume things that make you less happy if you can avoid it. So you might enjoy this lecture now more or less, but you're consuming it to increase your well-being of having a bachelor degree, master degree at some point, which requires to consume this lecture. So in the long term, you're consuming it for an increased well-being. You're eating a bar of chocolate, or I can see a lot of mate drink bottles here, because you want to get something out of this that increases your well-being. And that usually works on a certain level. So getting your basic needs covered, shelter, water, food, is a tremendous increase in well-being. Eating a piece of chocolate is also an increase of well-being for most people. 2 pieces of chocolate, 3 pieces of chocolate, 4 pieces of chocolate. If I force feed you 10,000 pieces of chocolate, your well-being will drop significantly at a certain point. Whether it's going to be 5, 10, or 100 pieces of chocolate, that's probably an individual problem for all of you, or an individual question for all of you. But the sheer amount of consumption does not linearly increase your well-being. Usually at some point for most things, except for maybe certain drugs maybe, there is usually a peak and then it goes south. And this is true for separate products, goods, and services that you can consume. But also, if you abstract from this, looking at one particular thing that you can consume, to consumption in general. Usually, most tech companies, or essentially you can say most industries, trying to sell you something so that you consume it with a goal or with a promise that then you will feel better. And they're competing about your financial power to buy their consumables, or in the more digital age, they are competing about your attention, which then can consume certain apps or services, and you only have a certain amount of either financial money to buy consumables, or living time or being awake time per day that you can use to consume something. So there is like a 24-hour day. You cannot consume more digital services in 24 hours a day. You can try to paralyze certain things, but at some point it gets a little bit ridiculous. And the main point being here is you can consume anything on this more abstract level up to a certain point, and it will increase your well-being. If you are force-fed consumption, your well-being will also decrease, similar to the example with the chocolate that I gave before. You can either look at this for one particular product or consumable, or for consumption in general. If you consume something, it probably makes you a little bit more happy, increases your well-being. If you're force-fed consumption, it will also decrease your well-being over time. So you have an overstimulation, and usually associated with an overstimulation or an overconsumption is then a lack of time or a stressor, maybe a lack of sleep, which then causes stress, or if you're talking about consumables in exchange for money, the stress of where do you get the money to continue the consumption habit that you have. A little bit like a drug habit, potentially. Good. That was the first part for now. So eco-efficiency, eco-consistency, eco-sufficiency, and then this brief look at consumption in contrast to well-being. First, rather steep curve, then you have some kind of saturation, and at some point it even decreases your well-being the more you consume either of a certain good or of consumption in general. What we're now going to do is a little bit of a detour that could feel like a little bit of a cut for now. But I hope that I can tie all the strings back together in the end of this detour. And it tackles, or it goes a little bit in this direction that I teased at the beginning of this lecture, and very much fits into this whole automation, and AI is gonna take over all of the tasks that humans don't want to do. If we have a sufficiently developed AI and robotic automation, we do not have to work at all anymore. It will be paradise on Earth, because we will live in a world that is full of stuff that we consume, and we don't even have to do anything anymore. So let's start, or just quick recap of the sustainability definition that we had before. The most sustainable thing that you can do is to consume less. We established that before, even though there were some minor discussions whether this is true in all cases or just most. If you consume less, there's a high probability that you also have to spend less money and less time on making sure that you can consume things, which could, for example, result in lower living costs. If I choose to live in a 120 square meter apartment compared to a 50 square meter apartment, there is most likely a decrease in costs for rent. If you decide to not require a battery electric vehicle, you do not have to pay for a battery electric vehicle if you just don't need one and can go by bike everywhere. Same with vacations in Harz region instead of going on the cruise ship tour, and so on and so on. So usually that would mean that you just need or have a lower financial burden. If you have lower living costs, probably also don't need to work that much anymore, right? If you have to somehow make 5,000 bucks a month to cover all of your costs, and suddenly you only need 2,000. So if you previously have worked 40 hours to get 5,000, how many hours do you now need to get 2,000 bucks? Probably less. I mean, sure, you can still work for 5,000 bucks and then put 3,000 aside, but why are you doing this if you already have enough? Maybe to get a little bit of financial buffer, sure, makes sense, could be helpful, but at some point if you have 100K in buffer, like why having more and more? We're talking about sufficiency here. So do I have enough or do I really need more? But back to the point that I actually wanted to make. So consuming less means I have less or lower living costs. Lower living costs means I probably have, or I can afford to work less because I have to make less money. And putting that then in combination with technological advances like robotics, AI, and all the other stuff that they are promising us, that should actually even reduce my workload even further. If we're automating all the tasks that I were doing in the past, if you're putting an AI robot here doing my lectures, then I should have more free time, right? Then I should be able to do more of the other stuff that I would like to do. And this is actually something that has been predicted before, very, very long time ago, by one of the godfathers of economics, John Maynard Keynes, who predicted in a 1930 essay a 15-hour work week. Called this essay Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. It's actually quite simple to read, to be honest, and also quite short. So if you want to read a historical piece by a supposedly great thinker, please go ahead. It's quite nice. And that even then sparked a lively debate whether this is actually possible and whether this prediction is going to be true. And this debate is somehow going on until today, at least in certain circles. The main problem with Keen's prediction was that he did not, because obviously it's not true, like no one is working 15 hours. Or not, like some by choice or by force, but in general we're not working 15 hours. Most people who are from this academic graduating circle that I'm like living in most of the time, because I'm working with a lot of people who have graduated university and so on, they're actually working way more than 40 hours a week, which would be the default in Germany. They're mostly working 50, 60, 70 hours a week. So we're even further away from those 15 hours. And not just because we're unskilled laborers, we're actually supposedly skilled laborers, but so why do we work that much? So Keen's prediction obviously isn't correct. There was the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of technological advancements since 1930, all that stuff just didn't happen. One of the problems that Keynes did not account for is the massive increase in consumerism. He assumed the same as we just did in our like short logical deduction example, that if I just consume less, then I need less money, then I need to work less, and therefore I have more time. And Keynes pretty much fell into that same logic fallacy hole, because most of the time, or for whatever reason, most of the time people fill those gaps then with new ways that they can use to consume things, which then increases again the need for money, and then you have to work more. So essentially the increased consumerism made up for all the technological advancements that happened since Keynes made that prediction. So the majority of people chooses more toys and pleasure over less work hours. Why? That's a question for the psychologists and sociologists. We're looking more now into some other interesting aspects. So definitely contradicts our sustainability paradigm, but that didn't really bother Keynes back then. So let's have a little bit of a closer look into labor as a concept and some implications that we can draw from this. So first, graph with the distribution of the labor force in different sectors. So in the 1850s, more than 50%, or actually more than 60% of the people worked manually somehow in the agricultural sector. Well, nowadays, most of that work is done by large machines and very few people. So since the 1970s, there is almost no one, given the bigger scheme, working in the agricultural sector anymore. We still are able to feed more people than ever. At the same time, people working in the industrial sector increased until a certain point before it dropped, not quite as far as the agricultural labor force, but also significantly. The only thing that steadily rose since the 1850s is the service sector. More and more people working in some kind of a service provisioning employment, or are somehow in a service provisioning employment situation than ever before. That can be writing software. That can be, of course, also sitting at some kind of bureaucratic office where you're handing out pieces of paper with forms on this. Can be a lawyer, tax consultant, or whatever. So everything where you provide a service instead of actually producing a piece of good, something that you can take away, or like, for example, food. A guy called David Graeber looked at this and also some of the implication in one of his books a little bit deeper, as a very catchy title. First, it was an essay that he called On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs, a work rant that he really just wrote as a rant because he was pissed. And then later, he wrote a whole book about this. What he wrote about is pretty much, so he was also a researcher. Unfortunately, he's dead now. He died a few years ago, even though he was still quite young. He was a professor for anthropology, if I'm pronouncing that correctly and not mistaken. Was at a pretty renowned university in the UK, was also part of these Occupy Wall Street movements, wrote a few interesting books, quite successful guy. And he was very interested in this prediction that Keynes made about this 15-hour work week and why it never happened. But he was also very interested in this question of whether people actually find joy or, more importantly, meaningfulness in their job. So after some frustrations, he had essentially asked various of his friends and people like, hey, do you actually enjoy your job? Is it something meaningful? And if you stop doing your job today and not show up tomorrow anymore, would the world be a worse place? Are you actually doing something good for the world or not? And then essentially playing out this thought experiment in the essay, and also making some like social media surveys. What would happen if certain professions suddenly completely disappear? If all our garbage people disappear and are not showing up for work tomorrow anymore, we would be in deep shit. What happens if all the bankers suddenly disappear? Would that really be a worse or a better world? What happens if all the tax consultants disappear? Would we really have any problems? Maybe some minor, but the world would still continue to turn and spin and would probably not fall into disrepair as a society. If teachers disappear, we might have some problem. If doctors disappear, we might have some problems, and so on and so on. If the few people who still work in agriculture disappear, we also might have a problem, because then we don't have food. So there is a certain amount of people who are absolutely essential, or professions, not people, professions that are absolutely essential for the well-being of a society, especially of complex societies. And some of them seem to be some kind of a luxurious good that is nice to have and potentially serves maybe a purpose, but under very specific circumstances. But if we have to choose, we can probably live without them. And he made a survey and essentially asked, do you think that your job is necessary? Do you have the feeling that your job contributes somehow to the well-being of society? And surprisingly, a lot of people said no. They said, I have an absolute bullshit job, which was a little bit intuitive for him to say yeah, but on the other hand, also quite surprising of how many people said, yeah, I have a bullshit job. My job does not contribute to the well-being of our society in any way. So in that essay, you first wrote about this a little bit. It's like 8-9 pages, very nice and simple to read. And then later you made this into a book where he looked at this from a way more scientific perspective. To start, let's go for the definition that he took for a bullshit job, because I think it's quite important to straighten that out first, because there's like a very important distinction between me saying your job is bullshit or yourself saying my job doesn't contribute to the well-being of society. So a bullshit job is a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though as part of the conditions of the employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that it's not the case. So two things essentially here. You say yourself, my job is pointless, and you're still pretending that it is important. So it's not about I'm saying your job is pointless and you're pointless and so on. It's essentially a self-assessment, which is for the sake of being nice to people an important distinction. Curiously, that should actually never happen if we're living under capitalism, because capitalism is supposedly eliminating inefficiency, sorry. It somehow also eliminates efficiencies, yeah, but that's a different story. No, seriously, it's supposed to not allow for that. Capitalism is supposed to find ways to produce a certain good or offer a certain service in the most efficient way, because that should be the cheapest way to offer that service. If I have unnecessary costs in that, that means I have to charge someone an unnecessary high premium, which then someone else could exploit and offer the same service cheaper, and then I lose all my customers. Nonetheless, this still exists, and also in an astonishing amount of cases that people say my job is completely pointless. So how could that happen? He made various surveys, like first he just asked on his Twitter followers, and he made some social media surveys, then he also looked into other more academic ways of making those surveys. And he got a huge amount of feedback and a lot amount of responses, some of them short, some of them very lengthy explanations. He put some of them in this book, and then he started categorizing those different types of jobs for the further analysis. The first category he called the so-called flunkies. They serve to make their superiors feel important. So for example, you have a receptionist, you have an administrative assistant, a door attendant, a store greeter, maker of websites whose sites neglect ease of use and speed for looks. So something that where you definitely can justify, like I'm not saying like this is like the important thing why I first did the definition. This does not say that all receptionists or all administrative assistant tasks are bullshit. Those are self-reported assessments of a fraction of or a subset of those jobs who said, I don't really do something for my superior. I'm just here so that they feel nice about themselves or look better. So really important distinction going back to this definition. So this was the first category. Then goons. Goons act to harm or deceive others on behalf of their employers. This could be lobbyists. I would agree, if all lobbyists disappeared tomorrow, we would hopefully notice because the world just got better. Corporate lawyers, telemarketeers, public relations specialists, community managers. Once again, going back to the definition, not all of those are bullshit. Those are self-reported. Third, duct tapers. Temporarily fix problems that could be fixed permanently. So programmers repairing bloated code. You could just rewrite the code and not have bloated code anymore. But maybe you do not get the permission to do so. Airline desk staff who calm passengers whose bag do not arrive, instead of just making sure that the stuff arrives. Sometimes you cannot fix it, sometimes there are just things you cannot prevent. But in a lot of cases, according to the self-reports, there was no interest in fixing the underlying problem because in the short term it was cheaper to just hire duct tapers. Rewriting the whole code for Windows whatever would have been more expensive than just putting some duct tape around it and hoping that it works because people already paid for it. Box stickers, they create the appearance that something useful is being done when it's not. For example, survey administrators, in-house magazine journalists, corporate compliance officers, quality service managers. And from a personal experience, I can say at least some of those people are working at our university. Sometimes I even have the feeling that I'm also a box ticker myself, based on all the forms that I'm having to fill out, that I'm quite sure no one will ever look at. Not necessarily from the university, but more in this bureaucratic setting of doing research at a university, in this larger scheme of having to acquire research funding and justify research funding and so on and so on. I'm definitely part-time box ticker, because those tasks are utterly pointless. And last, if I'm not mistaken, taskmasters. They create extra work for those who do not need it. Middle management, leadership professionals, sometimes you could also call them teachers, but they go in this leadership direction. And this process briefly looked at an important message. And this transition from having a meaningful job that once served a purpose to now coming in this situation of saying my job is pointless is what he called, like, of course, all marketing terms here, bullshitization, because it's catchy. It's a transition of a meaningful job into a bullshit job through corporatization, marketization, or managerialism. Sorry. He also looked at some statistics and some numbers. He is, as I said, also a university person, so some of the things that he looked at are university numbers. On the left, we have numbers 1976 compared to 2011 and then to 2018. So we have the whole faculty size in 1976 as 434,000. We had until 2011 an increase by 76%. Then we were close to the 800,000, so the university grew quite substantially. There are a lot of executive and administrators who got up there. So initially we had below 100,000, then we had more than 230,000. We had some other professionals who grew from 150 to almost 700,000. Non-professional staff also increased a little bit. Student enrollments almost doubled in those 40 or 35 years. So instead of 11 million students, they were now serving 20 million students. You also had the numbers then later for 2018 to just compare the 1976 back to 2018. But let's start first with the 1976 to 2011 comparison. So most intuitively, you would say if we have twice the amount of students, we need probably to increase our staff somehow. If we really need twice as many people, is up for discussion. For example, I can give this lecture in front of 2 people, 20 people, or 200 people. Still enough to have one Benjamin here. When it comes to grading the homeworks, I might need more support. I can grade the homeworks of 2 people myself. 20, it's getting a little bit tight on my schedule. 200, this is where Chintan comes into place. So some things scale up very nicely, others do not scale that well. So you probably have then something between you need 0% more staff to you need to double the staff as well if you double the amount of students. There is not really a written rule, and it's way too specific to say this would have been the correct number. But what catches the eye is that certain professions or certain categories in this table grew way more significantly than others. So faculty, which means essentially teachers, professors, researchers, grew less than the amount of students, which is something you would probably say is more or less in the same ballpark and could work. Why the executives grew more than the students would be something worth potentially looking into. And why the other professionals that are somehow associated with all this whole construct grew 4 times as much as the amount of students is something that's quite interesting. And the numbers are even like more drastic if you then go just 7 years further, where the other professionals grew even more. So there is some kind of a tendency to have an over, how do you say this? Not even, I cannot even tell it in German or English. Over proportional amount of growth for certain categories here. And in this book, he also gave various examples, of course, anecdotal examples, but also some statistical examples that due to the corporatization of this particular universities that he looked into, which also happens here, there's a tendency that universities have acquired more managing staff, more servicing staff, and even if there is no need for them anymore, you don't let them go because you have them. You might need them later. But of course, there's also a little bit of more regulations coming into place. You have to fulfill or to fill out more forms compared to earlier. Like if you had to fill out 1 form per student as a university back in the 1970s, you now have to fill out 50 forms. So you need more people doing that. If you have a super simple examination regulation in 1970, you now have several pages. Now you also have to do sustainability reporting. You have to do various diversity reportings. So there's also, of course, a regulatory aspect that creates more and more work. It's not just that we have more students now than before, but also regulatory body increased. But this is exactly an example of this corporatization or managerialism that he discussed earlier. Like there was there's still a perfectly fine justification for various staff options at the university, especially on the servicing level. But due to this corporatization that we need a form for everything, that we need to tick every box, that we have to make sure that we have, every professor needs to have 1 assistant. No matter if it's one professor with 15 researchers, or if it's just a professor, you need one assistant, because otherwise it would look bad. We had this category before. And they were like, I'm essentially jumping back and forth different examples now, but the point I'm trying to make in here is that an over-proportional or unproportional amount of additional work is added as part of either corporatization or this managerial aspect, or also marketization. Back when my parents went to the university, you went to that university because they were a good research university. There wasn't much about marketing budgets. How much we're blowing now on marketing budgets, on which social media platforms we are, what TikToks we're doing, and so on and so on. Like this, of course, also adds further to those extra additional workload that is somehow associated with a university. But if university marketing disappears tomorrow, would the world really be a worse place? Probably not. Good. So those essentially being examples that did not make it into the prediction of Keynes. So he did not account for corporatization. He did not account for new ways of marketing. He did not account for this emerging managerial structure that was created within first corporations and big companies, but then also later made it into the bureaucratic body of governments. That new tasks, new things were invented, and that this was also somehow super fueled by people wanting to consume more, by being able and allowed to consume more, because we had those technological advancements that just made sure that we consume on a much larger scale as we could have done in 1850, for example. It still begs the questions, why we even have that? Because theoretically, in our economic system that strives for efficiency, we should not have any unnecessary positions that we somehow could avoid. We should not have overly complicated bureaucratic processes if there would be ways around them. We should not have unnecessary marketing and so on and so on. So how do we still have those types of additional extra work that people report themselves does not really do anything? It's just for the show. He proposes the theory that most of our economic system is not really capitalism anymore, but rather some kind of managerial feudalism. So feudalism, as a reminder to history course, was what you had with these kings. Like you had a king, and then below the king there are some like nicely appointed people that the king liked to manage and run some stuff, and everything below that was essentially peasants who had to do all the work. So king, some nice lords, and then peasants below, and you had to do your job. You're more important king, the more peasants and more people you have below you, and the bigger your empire, and that was essentially the metric that said how successful and how important you are. How big is your empire and how many people do you have below? That is also mostly the metric in a lot of corporations, like how important am I as a professor? The more research money I make, which directly translates to how many PhD students do I have? How many secretaries do I have? How many labs and rooms can I occupy? That essentially defines how important and relevant I am as a professor. And he essentially makes a theory that parts of capitalism are somehow split from the system and are now mostly incentivizing this managerial feudalism, that you are okay with inefficiencies in the system and people not really doing productive jobs and productive things anymore, because for you and your importance within the system, it is more useful to have people you're paying for not doing really a proper job for the sake of having and exercising power. So the pains of dull work is a justification for the ability to fulfill consumer desires, and fulfilling those desires is the reward for suffering through pointless work. Because you could also then, of course, ask, if you're saying my job is pointless, why you're not just getting a different job? Maybe it's not that easy to find a different job, and also, at least I'm getting rewarded, I'm getting some kind of a pay perks that somehow make the suffering worthwhile. Why are you listening to this lecture? Because maybe you're interested in finding it interesting, or you're suffering through it in order to get the rewards points of credits and at some point a bachelor or a master degree. Pretty much the same logic here. So bullshit jobs serve political ends and not economical ends, and definitely not social ends, because they're actually antisocial. And parties are more concerned about having jobs than whether the jobs are fulfilling. That is probably something that you either already encountered in your life as some of your part-time jobs that you might had, or full-time jobs, or you might potentially will encounter in your future, that you rather have a job than a fulfilling job. First, you want a job at all so that you can cover your needs. And once you have covered your needs, you're like, okay, I'd rather have this shitty job which pays me well than having a more meaningful job that is actually cared for or valuable to society than and does something than having what is associated with less money, essentially. So why are you choosing to go and serve OpenAI and make some millions, while you could also do something more meaningful for society because it makes more money? When a lot of the Digitech students choose their field of application, one of them, so for everyone who's not studying digital technologies, there are like different fields of specializations. For example, the circular economy, Industry 4.0, autonomous driving, energy, and something else. And not exclusively, but a lot of the reasons why or a lot of the times I often heard this argument that students chose their field with respect to where am I earn most money in the future. Am I interested in this? Yeah, maybe partially, but it's definitely where I do most money. Is the circular economy and sustainability field maybe more societal beneficial than making a shitload of money so I can consume more? There's probably space for a discussion there, but those arguments essentially go in the same, like they apply here in the same context. So either you may find yourself in this situation in the future, or you are already in this situation that you're essentially working with this reward for suffering through pointless work. So why are we all still doing this? Because economic forces are quite strong. As a single person, dropping out of the system is rather difficult. As a society, it requires various amounts of change. Why are we having this discussion in the first place? Is because we'll talk about a potential solution or a potential building block for a solution in a second, but also because in this bigger picture, I find it highly relevant in this context of AI and continuous optimization through robotics and other means of modern digital technologies. We have already, according to the study data, a quite large amount of people who do not think their job serves any purpose and doesn't contribute to society or the well-being of society, but they're still doing it. So it seems like we already have the capacity to utilize this workforce in a different way for the bigger good. Especially, quick note to the side, we talked about the circular economy, that it takes 270 times as much time to rebuild an engine and to create a new engine. And we had this discussion, okay, where is all this time supposed to come from? Maybe by not letting people do stupid work that is pointless would be one thing, but that's essentially just a side note. So we're working more than 40 hours. We're definitely working more than 15 hours, despite the fact that some people obviously seem to do non-relevant work. Now we're developing a huge amount of automation and AI with a promise of telling everyone then, okay, then you have to work less because we can automate everything, so you will be less stressed and there will be more free time and so on and so on. Despite the fact that there is already more free time available, but at the same time, the economic system also forces everyone and makes them shitload afraid of not having a job, because otherwise they would not have the means to sustain themselves anymore. Like if you think back at this well-being graph, having your foundational needs, water, food, and shelter met, increases your well-being significantly. Having health insurance is something that probably a lot of Americans dream of. Affordable health insurance also increases your well-being significantly if you compare it to not having any health insurance or access to medical facilities. So those first step heavily increase it. If you do not have a job at the moment, you lose all those necessities, because there are very few countries where you have a safety net, such as in Germany, where there's at least the option to be cared for, to have your foundational needs met. And this weird disparity between, we promise you all that you have to work less, and there's actually already unnecessary work being done, but at the same time, you're a shitload scared that you don't have a job and that you have more time, because otherwise you cannot afford to live anymore. And figuring out a way to this weird dilemma is probably also one of the hidden challenges of the 21st century, because there are probably going to be further extensions into automation and other stuff. At the same time, what do we do with all those peoples? So I know it's a little bit of a, like we're doing a little bit of mental gymnastics here with this different paths through this bullshit stuff, just to make the point that there are obviously already unnecessary work being done that doesn't contribute to society, putting it then back into this context of automation, AI, and so on. But I hope that this dilemma or this weird disparity somehow became a little bit more clear. Like, this is not going to be the major part of the exam, so don't worry, it was more like a thought experiment or a mental exercise here. What we're going to look at now is a potential building block that can help to ease the problem. I'm not using any further complicated words anymore. For people who do not either want to or have to work anymore because their job has been automated, or because they notice, okay, I have a job that doesn't contribute to society anymore, so I'm not going to do it anymore, which is the universal basic income. But we're going to do that after a 5-minute coffee break, because I need another coffee and a short break, and my phone is ringing nonstop. So we will be back in 5 minutes from now and start the second part of the video recording. See you in part 2. That was too harsh. That was the wrong button.